Section 3, Part 3. We're continuing the player input. We're going to start on implementing the mapping context. So if you recall on the data here, we have these mapping context, and we need to apply that. So let's call that function set input to default. Create that function. I'll put it here. Actually, we need to pass in, so we can turn this off later if we need to. We pass in if it's enabled or not. And we'll default it to true. Pass anything if we're just turning it on. So we just need to confirm that we've got the data, just this, and we also need to check that we have the mapping context isn't null in the data. And then we can just assign we can just add the mapping context whether it's true or not. So we'll create some functions for adding and removing mapping context in here. Make this virtual as well, in case we want to change it or something. It's going to declare that. So in here we need to cast to our player controller, and we can just use that get controller function to do that. Not changing anything, calling a function in there. And it doesn't need to be our type, it's just the generic player controller, not some type of our own. And now we're going to need the reference to the enhance input local player subsystem. That's why we need the player controller, so we can get the local player, and that's where we can get access to the local player subsystem. The one, so that's going to include that H file there, the enhanced input subsystem. And then we'll just use our controller player. Long one. At the start, we might just check straight up that we've actually passed in a valid input mapping. In the wrong function, I'm in remove, sorry. I was doing add input here, so although it's pretty much the same to remove. Anyway, so we just want to check if we've got a valid input mapping. And now we can just, if it doesn't have this context, so we just want to check the input subsystem. If it doesn't have the mapping context already, then we're going to add it. Input subsystem using. We want to add mapping context. Oh, sorry, we need to pass the priority as well. Is mapping priority. There we go. So that's added the mapping, and then, as I said, it's pretty much the same. Yeah, we'll grab all of this. And then we'll just use the input subsystem, and we don't have to check if it's got it or not. If it doesn't have it, it won't do anything. So we're just removing the mapping context and passing context. Right, so now we can come back to our set input to default and just do be enabled. So if be enabled, we want to add mapping. We're going to pass the input data. Mapping context default. Oh man. And this one's going to be the priority. Mapping context. No, that's not it. The mapping priority. I'll call it map priority default. And if it's not, then we're going to remove the context and just pass the mapping context default. Alright, so if we call set input default to false, then it's going to remove the context that's still in. There's probably one other thing we want to do here. We want to set the input mode, so we want a mouse cursor, you might want it to lock to the screen or not. But we need to set the input mode to game and UI, generally for an RTS. Whatever your settings are, you can put them in this function. So we're going to just call it set player input mode. This in here as well. I think I'll call this up a bit. Call it here. We don't need to pass anything to this. Should be right. So we're going to need a reference to our player controller. Actually, I'm going to need the input subsystem as well, because actually I'm going to change this. So I'm going to call this before I set any input mappings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the input mappings in this function. So if there's any existing mappings for whatever reason, say from a menu or something before the player pawn is spawned, then the player will have all input removed from the menu. We'll copy just to subsystem. What's it called? I think it's clear. Clear all mappings. So that'll go into there, clear all the mappings, and then apply the default one. Now we want to set the input mode to game and UI. There's a function that hides the cursor when you click, so we want to disable that. Or not a function, a setting. I'm not going to lock because it's just super annoying when you're trying to debug multiple windows. If you wanted to run some sort of window mode and not go outside, like that's just a generic function in the player controller. Applying the input mode to the local player by the looks of it. Don't need to worry about that. We do need a reference to our player controller list. Oh no, doesn't want to be const, that's all it is. And the last one is we want to show the cursor. There's one other thing we need to do, and that's, so we've got all our settings on our input data. So let's just go to that for a sec. So we've got these settings here. So start zoom, and we've got our, it's not on the settings, but we've got our target location, and we've got our target rotation. We just need to set all these things, like initialize them. So I'm just going to put it in a function as well, I think, that gets called here. And we'll just call it set pawn control defaults. So in here, we'll just check that it's locally controlled because we don't need to set this on the server or anything. Where's it easily controlled? Oh, actually, we need to check. We need to check whether the spring arm is valid and the input data is valid as well. So we'll set the location default, set the zoom default, and the location default. That's pretty straightforward. We're just going to set it wherever it's spawned. That's its target location, so we don't want it to move. Target zoom, we had the value in the input data. You can control what the zoom's at when you start the game. So for rotation, we need to get the spring arm's current relative rotation. It should be 0, but if it's not, we just want to set that. We also want to initialize our pitch and yaw. So get the rotation. And then we'll just build a rotator for the target rotation. Actually, I think we had a start pitch, or minus the start pitch. I think start pitch. Maybe not. Maybe that's another one I forgot. Add that in. That's the pitch. Ready for the roll. And then for our pitch and yaw, we'll set it to the current target rotation pitch. Which should be the current, the current pitch and yaw. The end of this, so once those variables are set, we can start ticking. So this is where we'll set that B is initialize. True. And that'll, if you recall, in our tick, we had the B initialized false by default. So then that'll be ticking and start updating the camera position. It'll start accepting player input essentially. I think it's time to give this a build and see if we've made any errors. Okay, so we've got an error. Like do with the spring arm component. Okay, pretty easy. I just did a failure on the copy paste there. So the camera component, it's trying to touch the spring arm to itself. So let's try that again. Right, so this, I just noticed this error come up in the log. It's still loaded the editor fine, but I think we do need to initialize that because we're going to be in that template. Here in this template, we're going to be just updating values. So we need the values to be there and set. So in the constructor, actually I might do it in the input since it's an input related thing, and we'll do the set input default. No, sorry, that's not what I meant. The on control defaults. So in here, just before we allow input to occur, we're going to initialize our struct. This is for the modifier Boolean values. We need to go to our data types for player. This here, so we'll need a constructor here, I think. Good, and then that's all we need, just a generic constructor. So then we can copy this, and in our initialization, modify key types, and then we can just call the constructor like that to initialize it, and it'll initialize with all false. That's what we want. And that should sort out this error as well. So do a quick build again. Right, so no errors that time. Hope you had as much luck. Right in the editor, I think the first thing we might do is create the data asset. Create a data folder in the plugin RTS Player content. Miscellaneous. Press it. Search for my data. Call this DA. Call it default. If we open this up, we've got our control parameters, our default mapping context, all our keys and contexts we need to assign. So let's start by just putting in some defaults. And this is probably something you want to have a play with yourself, but this will get us started. The min pitch is -10 and the max 80. Start pitch I'll make 35, so that'll be the angle looking down at the start. Zoom, make it 1000. It's all going to depend on your game type really, what you want this to, but this will do us fine for testing. Now we can define our controls. So normally I'd migrate these for another project, but I'm going to create them from scratch for anyone that hasn't followed along on the enhanced input series. So we're going to start with a folder. It's going to be then here we're going to have action. And in actions we'll create another folder and we'll just call this default in case you want to have some other configuration later on. And we just need to go to input action. And this first one, actually we'll create the modifiers first because they're nice and easy. So we'll go shift. And if we come into here, it needs to be set to bool, which it is. That's all we need to do. So now we can just duplicate this 4 times. duplicate this one again, and I'll call this look. Another easy one, but it just has to be a float. In fact, I think the only complicated one is move and duplicate look, create zoom, because that's a axis 1D as well. And that, and duplicate again, and rotate will be the same. But and our select and commands, they can just be bools. Which I don't even think we were using the value, so let's just make it boolean. So copy this space here. This can be that again, command. And we don't need any separate actions for command hold and command end. It's all this one action. It'll just trigger off different events. The other one we need is one called relook that links to the look command. It's a bit bool though, not. I'll just duplicate a bool one here. And that is to toggle the middle mouse held. So the actual look command will be moving the mouse, so it'll be mouse Y, because we'll tilt up and down. And free look will be another key that we need to activate in order for this one to work. You'll see when we set up the context. Now we can set up our context. So over context, put in context, I'm going to call this IM default. We need to add our mappings. So the first one, we might as well do move, most complicated. We're going to need a few keys for this one, WASD, and we'll do the directional arrows as well. I do W, S, forward and backwards, right, oops. And I'm doing it in that particular order because it makes sense as you set it up. Now, in order to get 4 different inputs into a vector 2, you need to do some things. So the way the vector 2 works is you've got X and Y values in there. So X is going to be forwards and backwards, and X is the first element. And so when I press W, we want X to be 1. When we press X, so we want to go backwards on the X, or in the negative direction on the X, we would need to put this to -1. So we're going to add a modifier here and a negate. So that'll make it a negative number. So it'll be -1. So don't worry about that. You can leave that on, it doesn't really matter. So now on the right, we want to do the same. So we want to have 1 to the right and -1 to the left. So with the enhanced input, it doesn't put the value, it only puts the value into the first element of the vector. What you need to do is a thing called a swizzle, which swaps the Y and the X around. So then Y will be the first element and it will put a value into the Y element. So on the D, we're going to add swizzle. And we should be able to set the order here. So yeah, we want Y, X, Z. Most importantly, we've got Y at the front. Doesn't really matter what the other values are. For the A, we do the same thing. We want to swizzle it so we get to the Y value. But then we also want to negate it, so it makes it a negative. And that's that. So now we just need to do the same thing for the directional keys that we've got here. So if you're ever struggling to remember what this is or how to set it up, the move thing, it's on the enhanced input documentation page. I'll put a link in the description, but honestly, you only have to do it once and then you can just copy this in. Let's add our next one and we'll add look. And look is the mouse Y, so it's our pitch. So it'll be just up and down on the mouse movement. But we don't want it to happen all the time, obviously, so that's why we need that free look trigger. So what we're going to add here is a trigger, and we're going to call it a corded action. So you can see there it says corded action that must be triggered for this trigger's action to be triggered. That's the most confusing sentence ever. Basically, whatever we assign here needs to be activated so this works. So this activates as well, not just. So in order for mouse Y to send an input, this whatever action we put here, so this free look, needs to be activated as well. So it needs to be in the triggered state. And you can mess with the threshold times, doesn't really matter for that one. It's works good as it is. So let's add the free look next, which will be just our middle mouse. And that's it for that. But, yeah, middle mouse, that's good. Leave that like that. What else we got? Let's do zoom, middle mouse. And I'm actually going to invert the zoom. So this preference thing really, I just like it that I think it's pull back on the wheel mouse, zooms out. You might like it the other way around. Rotate. So rotate's going to have two inputs. So the first one will be Q. One will be E, sorry. And just negate E. So you can switch that around whichever way you want. Rotate around. And then we just got our select and command inputs, which are just left and right mouse button. So select is left mouse button, and is right mouse button. Get there. And then it's our modifiers. So we've got what's one is Alt, left Alt. We could add both Alts here, so we could add left and right Alt like that. Don't need any settings on them. Control, name again. Make this leave that is everything. Save our context. I just got an error. I missed one. Can't have an empty input action titled. Wrong one. Added heal that one. Interesting that it puts it in there automatically. Space. That's our mapping input mapping context done. And now we can start assigning this in our data. So we've got our input mapping, we've got move. There we go, that's all assigned. The priority is 0. So 0 is the highest priority. Sorry, lowest priority. So something with 1 would override it. I think we're about ready to test. So we just need to assign our player as the default pawn. So we'll come up to content, framework, managers, game mode, and assign the default pawn to our player pawn. Should be good to go. Just check we've got a player start right there. So let's play. I'm just going to click into the window so it's activated. We've got left and right. Forward and backwards is going up and down. And that is probably because we haven't set up our trace channel. Stop this. So we come into project settings, collision. If you recall, we set up that define for the custom trace channel. This is where we're adding it. So call it terrain, and by default we want everything to ignore it. And click accept. Now on our screen, on our landscapes here, we need to get every one of these. And go to collision, change this to custom. And this terrain here, which is defaulting to ignore like it should, for the terrain we want it to block. Sometimes you can get some weird behavior when you've just added the trace channel, like it might automatically. Oh no. Just restart your editor if it's not right. Now, if you recall, we're doing that trace to the terrain to keep the camera on the ground. Still going down. Alright, let's go back to IDE and check our cast, because something's going wrong there. Sorry, IDE. Oh, here I'll show you if you go to config and then default engine, you can see here, this is the game trace channel 1 terrain, so that's where you can see what your new channel is mapped to. I'm just going to copy this and go to our core, added game data, and that's right. Let's see where we're using this in the ray trace. So that's right. Start position. Oh, okay, that's the problem there. We were tracing from somewhere up in the air to somewhere up in the air, so it's never hitting the terrain. So that's a nice easy fix. Come back to our editor and we'll just do a live build. Oops, stop it, should be right still. There we go, so we're pushing forward now. We can zoom in, zoom out, rotate left and right. I can pitch, zoom, edit there. Oh, did I even remember signing the key for that? We go back to our context. Set the middle mouse. My bad. This should be set to mouse wheel axes. So we want both axes. Right. I just can't zoom in too far. Zoom. See, our start zoom's smaller than the minimum zoom. Make sure you click in the window, otherwise your keys won't work. So it has to activate the window. Alright, we're good. So let's just check on the hills over here. One thing I'm pressing shift at the moment and my modifiers aren't working, so we'll look at that. In the next video, I'm going to actually work on going to do a debug setup, so we'll debug that there. So this is mapping the terrain, so that's good. All right, so we'll leave it there. I'll see you in the next video where we will start setting up some, not just debug for the modifiers, but just in general debug tools, let's call it.